cenário do mundo é sombrio. Culpa da economia que durante 3 décadas cresceu galopante e agora o país mais rico luta contra a deflação e a União Europeia se arrasta para sair da crise. A geopolítica não é mais animadora. Estados Unidos e China rumam para confrontações comerciais de consequências imprevisíveis. Na década de 90, a economia de mercado parecia imbatível, com privatizações, menos regulamentação e rédeas soltas para bancos e investidores. Agora estamos na década do capitalismo de Estado, das nacionalizações e mercados freados. Quem vai ganhar a guerra entre os Estados e as corporações? O professor Ian Bremmer vive da análise destes e outros problemas mundiais. Uma combinação de enciclopedista com futurólogo. Você dá o nome do país ou do problema e ele dispara com dados e currículos precisos. Ele é mais conhecido como analista do que professor. Criou o grupo Eurasia, hoje um líder em pesquisa sobre riscos. 2 de seus livros são best-sellers em vários países do mundo. The End of Free Market, o mais recente, aborda o conflito entre capitalismo de Estado e de mercado. The J-Curve examina como nações enriquecem e empobrecem. Thanks again for coming here. You seem to know so much in so many details about so many countries that I wonder if you are ever surprised when you get the news.
Oh, sure. Sure.
You do?
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you, I was surprised this year when the North Koreans sank that South Korean ship, the Chonan, over 150 South Koreans dead. I mean, you know, this is a very fast-moving world, and we're hit all the time with pieces that we don't expect. That was one that absolutely took me by surprise, sure.
You mentioned one, and that's it.
Yeah, this year? That was the big one. No, because it was such a large risk.
Yeah.
And I mean, North Korea, I wouldn't say that it was stabilizing, but certainly they hadn't been provoking to the same degree over the previous year. So.
But is that front as dangerous as the press says it is, or it's exaggerated?
Look, I mean, you have a very brittle regime, and he's putting his 3rd son in place. You've seen the photos of Kim Jong-un. This does not look like a guy who's ready to take over the country. Totalitarian states can stay stable for a long time, but when they fall apart very quickly. The economic constraints are very great. It's pretty clear the Chinese do not have the level of influence that they would like to have over the North Koreans. So I think there is a real risk there. But the point is that that's the kind of risk that can spike very suddenly. Other issues that are really trends, the deterioration, the breakdown of U.S.-China relations, from my perspective, watching global politics, that's been coming for a long time. That was pretty obvious.
Now, in very broad terms, give us an idea. Where are we now? Where are we going the next few years, let's say 5 years, in the sense that are the rich getting richer, the emerging still emerging, poor getting poorer?
The emerging markets generally are still emerging. Certainly the most successful governments in growth in the world today following the financial crisis are not the developed world. It's not the United States, it's not Japan, it's not Europe, it's China, it's India, it's Russia, it's Brazil, it's Indonesia, it's Turkey, it's countries that still have relatively low per capita income and have all of the attention right now of the international community. The capital inflows are coming. But do I think that that's creating a world with higher levels of global growth? I do not. There's more conflict within the G20 than there ever was with the G7 or the G7 plus 1. And that is going to slow global growth as a whole. And it's going to cause a lot more conflict on trade, on currency, on climate, a lack of cooperation. I mean, the most important things happening over the next 5 years is that, first of all, challenges to globalization, as you see conflict between states as economic actors and corporations and the private sector as economic actors. And secondly, an absence of global authority, an absence of global cohesion and consensus that leads to much greater challenges emerging in places where public goods need to be provided.
Before we get into some specific countries,
Sure.
please explain the J curve, one of your best-known books, on how to turn an authoritarian regime into democracy and more than that. So what is the J curve?
Well, the idea behind the J curve is that there's a relationship between a country's openness, the free flow of ideas, people, goods across borders, and a country's stability, the propensity to actually implement stated policy in the incidence of shock. And the point is that countries like the United States, Japan, Finland, consolidated democracies, are stable because they're open, and they're very stable indeed. But other countries, like North Korea and like Cuba, are stable because they're closed. They're stable because they're closed. And those are countries that don't want to open. North Korea doesn't want Al Jazeera. They don't want CNN. They don't want Globo. They want to control everything going in and outside of their borders, because if it starts to open up, they fall apart. And the point of the J curve is that that relationship between a country's stability and a country's openness actually looks like a J. And for a country to move from authoritarianism to consolidated democracy, it becomes a lot less stable before it becomes more stable.
United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Will cuts bring prosperity?
That's a very good question, and we don't know the answer. There's no question that the cuts that we're seeing in Great Britain, 19% across the board, are serious, and when you add in inflation over the next few years, they're even more serious. Now, this government's going to be in place for probably 5 years. They have the ability to do it, and the Brits have a stiff upper lip about austerity. They'll take the pain. But will that lead to growth? That depends a lot on the global economic environment. I'm more concerned because I don't see growth generally being higher across the world, and so therefore, will the Brits be able to generate the jobs? They can get their deficit in order, sure, but will they be able to actually start generating more growth and more jobs? Because they're going to take a big hit. The average Brit's going to take a big hit. Is this the right time to be quite this steep? And also, what are they doing to help stimulate the private sector on the other side? This is not a British government. It's right-wing, but it's a British government that believes in cuts without the supply-side economics piece, right? They're not trying to make life easier for the corporate community and the banking community. That may prove to be a mistake in a tight economic environment.
And how does that apply to the European Union? And what would be the role of Germany and France there?
Well, Germany, what's interesting about the European Union, of course, is while there is a political and economic union in place, the trajectories of countries within the union are changing very dramatically. It used to be that, the general credit ratings of Greece and Germany were the same. There's a big arbitrage there because, of course, the countries were very different in terms of their sustainability. That's, of course, getting broken apart, and it should. The Germans now have a fairly strong growth trajectory along with other countries that are tied to them economically, like Poland, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Greeks, nowhere near that. So where do I think Europe is heading? It's not heading in one place economically. It's going to be increasingly differentiated.
The BRICS. Let's start with China. You wrote that China's communist leadership knows that the state cannot administrate a sustainable growth simply by decree, but that maybe they can do it for a very long time or not.
They can't do it forever. The way that state capitalism works is that as long as you have cheap stuff you can take advantage of, cheap stuff that other people don't have, you can be inefficient in the way you run your governments, and it can work. So Argentina, cheap land, worked really, really well until they ran out of land, and suddenly Argentina and America's trajectories look very, very different. Venezuela, cheap oil, until they run out of cheap oil and they destroy their economy, and suddenly Venezuela's in trouble. China, cheap labor.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fact is they have more cheap labor than anyone else. It is the world's biggest bubble. And they're not close to popping that bubble. You still have hundreds of millions of Chinese that are actually coming online and urbanizing, and that's where the Chinese government, with a new 5-year plan, will be actually devoting an enormous amount of resource. I think they can continue to grow at 8% plus for years.
For years.
Oh, easily for 5 more years, maybe for 10 or 15. And this is the challenge.
Without any explosion, any major reaction or turmoil.
Without any domestic explosion and reaction, there's going to be a lot of international reaction. You know, we've got 9.6% growth in China right now. We've got 9.6% unemployment in the United States. I don't want to say those two things are related, but there are a lot of folks that are going to make some political hay off that. There's a reaction.
You wrote in one of your recent commentaries that Indonesia, and on that one you actually made some analogies with Brazil. Indonesia is a much better brick than Russia.
Yeah.
Will be by 10-14. What's wrong with Russia?
Well, a couple of things are wrong with Russia. First of all, they have the worst population trajectory of any major country in the world, leaving aside war or famine. I mean, their population is shrinking. The corruption is immense and it's hard to deal with. And there's no rule of law, and the government is effectively run by Putin and Medvedev and Putin. People keep asking me, so is Putin going to come back?
Yeah.
I'm like, does it matter? I don't know why you're asking that question, but there's a lot of opacity there. Russia's basically an oil and gas play. It's like Saudi Arabia. They just have a lot more land.
That's how they're going to be for a while?
That's how they're going to be for a while. They're not going to see massive additional investment. There's the climate change issue, and of course they'll take advantage of the polar cap melting, and they'll have warm water ports they'll be able to use. That's interesting. But still, in terms of a sustainable, growing market, with population that's growing, with consumption that's growing, with investment opportunities that are growing, Brazil is a much more interesting market long term. Indonesia is a much more interesting market long term. And I think that there are many things that are similar about those countries. There are commodities, there's greater political stability, there's greater consensus, there are leaders that are speaking increasingly to a global G20 platform. They're countries that we should be excited about. Brazil's finally made it.
Brazil, but in the beginning of the year, you put Brazil among the riskier countries for 2010. After that, I think you reviewed that.
No. What I said with Brazil was that we have elections.
Yeah.
We had elections, and that I said that Dilma Rousseff was likely to win. And she has. And not a surprise, because Lula could get anyone through, but the point was she's not as charismatic as Lula, and she's going to support a stronger state than Lula, and not as many people will write about Brazil as they used to, so there is a risk attached to that. It's still a very good long-term trajectory, but this is it's going to concern some people in the markets that under the last 8 years of Lula, we're a little happier.
On your other bestseller, The End of the Free Market, about the war between the state capitalism and market capitalism.
Yeah.
Who is winning that war in Brazil?
Oh, in Brazil, the free market is absolutely winning. I mean, the state is becoming a little bigger with Dilma, there's no question.
Yeah.
But I think what we realized when Lula came in, Lula was running for election and everyone was scared. They said, oh my God, he's going to ruin, he's going to destroy the country. He's a trade unionist. He's going to stand up for labor, and he's not interested in bringing the country into the world. And of course, what we found is that, Brazil is a country with a great deal of political consensus, and incrementally, gradually, they're actually globalizing their country. And the state is more important in the Brazilian economy than it is in the American economy. But there is rule of law in Brazil. There's transparency in Brazil. And there's no question that while Brazil is still very much an emerging market, it's an emerging market which is reforming and becoming more of a regulated free market economy.
In general, going beyond Brazil, who is winning this war of state capitalism versus market capitalism?
Well, right now, the free market countries don't look so good. You know, the United States isn't growing. The Japanese aren't growing. The Europeans, except the Germans, aren't really growing. And even Germany is not exactly strong, boisterous growth. Who's growing? I mean, people that are growing the most effectively right now are either countries that are in the middle or, most importantly, countries like China, where the state is the most important actor. Now, that doesn't mean that the free market has failed. No. I don't believe it has. I think that the government failed in regulating certain sectors, but leaving that aside, it's still hard to make the argument for free markets today. And China's growth is so extraordinarily compelling that you have other countries around the world saying, you know what, maybe I need to be closer to that economic model.
It's inspiring. That model is inspiring a lot of countries.
It is, but it's also scaring a lot of countries. I travel a lot throughout Asia, and at the same time that economic growth in China is essential for sustainability of many of these economies, they're very scared about China's assertiveness on the military and security sphere that's been bolstered by that economic growth, and they're trying to hedge. You see that in countries like Singapore, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea. There's a lot of countries that 5 years ago were much more comfortable with the way the world was heading, and now they're saying, boy, we might have some problems because of all this Chinese growth.
What they might do, what's the option there?
Well, the option, first of all, is to start stimulating the U.S. strategic relationship. We're seeing more military exercises. We're seeing the Japanese talking about joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, a trade group that would bring the United States in, as opposed to ASEAN +3, for example, that would be, you know, sort of China dominated within Asia and Southeast Asia. That's a very different kind of environment. It's one where they're trying to balance the United States off against China, as opposed to being completely in the Chinese ambit, because they don't want to be subsumed by a state capitalist model. Keep in mind, state capitalism supports, it's using the market in the employ of the state. And for many of these smaller countries, they're very concerned that they will lose that battle.
You mentioned two other problems in the beginning, currency and trade. Will China devalue?
Sure they will, but they're going to do it at their pace. They're not responding to international pressure. I mean, they're willing to talk. But when you have American congressmen saying that we need a 25% devaluation or else, that is not happening anytime soon in China. If we get 3% a year, I think that would be, on balance, a fairly reasonable outcome from the Chinese perspective. The conflict is coming with China.
It is coming.
Oh, yeah. You know, Trotsky used to say, you don't want war, but war wants you. You know, we don't want conflict, but conflict wants us.
And so how do you see it's happening?
Well,
what's going to be the evolution on this?
I see so many areas in the West. Trade is one. I mean, you have indigenous innovation, where the Chinese used to say, we'll give you market share, you give us technology. Now they have the technology, and they're making it much tougher for market share for Western corporations who are coming into China, and their previous partners are now competitors. Competitors for market share in China, and competitors to export their goods on the global market in technological fields that are quite sophisticated. Things like high-speed rail, things like aviation, things like automotive.
Computer, the fastest.
Absolutely. Fastest supercomputer in the world, that's right now Chinese. And if you're a Western corporation, you're saying, I want you to do something about that. You need to level the playing field for me. This is conflict. This conflict is coming.
How the new scenario in the U.S., with the Republicans with more power, maybe certainly control of the House, weakening the presidency, how does that affect?
Not very much. I mean, you're going to see gridlock in Congress in the United States. It's true. It's going to be much harder for Obama to get policy through Congress after taking a big hit in midterm elections, as everyone expects. But you know, when I think about the things that Obama really wants to accomplish in the next year, in terms of a climate bill. He's likely to do much more through the Environmental Protection Agency because he can't get a climate bill through. You're probably not going to see a law providing tariffs on China if they don't move on their currency, but you'll see a lot more bills opened up against China through the United States trade representation. So, I mean, there are many ways that you'll still see policies that use executive authority by President Obama in the absence of coherence in Congress. But still, you're not going to see big legislation like health care through next year, and you wouldn't even if the Democrats did well in elections in the midterms. I don't think that's changing.
Two last questions. Why you don't like being called professor? You're very young.
I'm a young guy. I'm not. It seems too much of an honorific, you know.
You seem to be constantly on the move. You travel a lot. Just came back from Japan. Yeah. Is that to prepare your commentaries? You know,
it's a fast-moving world, and I don't think you can be really coherent to talk about it if you haven't actually visited these places, and not only to know what's going on, but also to understand the perspective of the people you're talking to. I mean, I can read all I want about China, but we need to understand the Chinese. These narratives are different. In a G7 world, you don't need to know as many narratives. In a G20 world, you better understand, especially if you're an American. You better take the time to understand that the people around you who matter have different views. They have different contexts, they have different backgrounds, and the only way you're going to do that is to get there and spend some time with them. I'm looking forward to doing that in Brazil next month.
That was the new question. The connections you have there, you seem to know São Paulo well.
I know São Paulo a little bit. I'm hoping I'll know it a little bit better when I come back next month.
And have you been to Rio, Brasilia?
I've been to Rio. I love Rio. I was in Rio right before they they announced the bid last for the Olympics. I missed the big party. I was very sorry about that.
Are you going to meet Dilma Rousseff?
We don't have it set up yet. We'll see. We'll see.
Did you ever meet Lula?
I've not met Lula before. No.
Ian, thanks again.
Nice.
Very nice. Yes. Se você quer saber mais sobre a nossa entrevista com Ian Bremmer, vá no nosso site. Muito obrigado.